Plot summary of Black Skin, White Masks by Frantz Fanon. Fanon talks about why he wrote Black Skin, White Masks in the beginning of the book. He says that we need to ask what man wants and what the black man wants to understand racism. Fanon tries to figure out how white and black people relate to each other. He says that both groups are stuck in their own racial identities. He says that psychoanalysis is a good way to understand the black experience and that it is possible to destroy the huge psychological complex that came about because of colonialism through psychoanalysis. He gives an overview of each chapter and ends by saying that white society has made up so many harmful myths about black people that make it hard to understand what it's really like to be black. In Chapter 1, Fanon talks about what it's like for black Antillians to go to France and become whiter by adopting the culture and language of the colonial government. Fanon says that when these Antillians go back to their home country, they are treated like they are better, which makes them act in a proud way. Many black people try very hard to prove to whites how smart they are, but Fanon says this is pointless because intelligence alone never saved anyone. When a white person speaks pidgin to a black person, the black person loses all sense of who they are. This is because speaking pidgin is a subtle, if unintentional, way for white people to remind black people of their lower status in the colonial order. White people are afraid of black people who are smart and well-educated, especially if they read revolutionary books like Karl Marx's. Fanon ends the chapter by saying that some people think M. Césaire knows how to use the French language better than any white Frenchman. Fanon says that if this is true, it shouldn't be surprising because the people of French colonies have the same right to be French as a white Frenchman. In Chapter 2, we look at Mayat Capiche's autobiographical novel I Am a Martinican Woman, which is about a black woman who is obsessed with marrying a white man, even though she knows that white men will always see her as less than them. Even though the book is very well known, Fanon doesn't like it because it encourages unhealthy behavior. In colonial culture, being white means being good and beautiful, and Martinican women like Mayat have been taught to think that they can save their race by making themselves whiter. They start to feel desperate for white approval, which makes them act in ways that hurt themselves and are not logical. Then Fanon moves on to a book by Abdoulaye Sadji called Nini. The main character of this book is a mixed-race Senegalese woman who wants to marry a white person but turns down the advances of a black man who loves her. Fanon says Nini shows how black women internalize racist ideas that they then use against black men and, in the end, also against themselves. In Chapter 3, Fanon looks at the situation from the other side, when black men want to sleep with white women. This time, he uses A Man Like Any Other by René Marin, an autobiographical book about a black Antillean man named Jean Venus who lives in Bordeaux, France. Jean is smart, but he has a lot of anxiety and is always trying to prove himself. He loves a white woman, and even though he has white friends who accept him, they only do so if he gives up being black, which makes him feel even worse about himself. Fanon thinks about the fact that many black men want white women because they want to dominate a European woman as a way to get back at white people. Fanon says that Jean has an abandonment neurosis, which is what Germaine Guex, a psychoanalyst, calls it. Fanon points out, though, that Jean's experience of this neurosis is different from what a white person would have, and that this means that our understanding of abandonment neurosis needs to change. In Chapter 4, Fanon talks about Octave Mannoni's book The Psychology of Colonization. In this book, Mannoni looks at how the colonizer and colonized think and feel about each other. Fanon disagrees with Mannoni's claim that colonized people are born with a sense of inferiority. Instead, Fanon says that the inferiority complex is a direct result of colonization. Fanon then looks at how different races, nationalities, and religions, even among people of color, are made to feel like they are better than each other. In the end, this helps keep the power structure of white supremacy in place. He disagrees with Mannoni's claim that the best parts of European culture are not to blame for colonialism. Instead, he says that all of Europe is responsible for violence in the name of colonialism. He also disagrees with Mannoni's claim that Malagasy people didn't know who they were before colonization. Instead, he says, colonization destroyed the Malagasy people's culture and sense of who they were. He comes to the conclusion that Mannoni doesn't really understand Malagasy culture and has no idea what it could be like if it were freed from colonial rule. In the most famous part of the book, which starts with chapter 5, Fanon talks about being on a train and hearing a scared white child say, "Look. A Negro." This interaction is very painful for Fanon, and the child's fear of him makes him feel very angry. He talks about how racism can make a person feel like they don't belong in their own bodies. Fanon uses Jean-Paul Sartre's argument about how anti-Semitic stereotypes hurt Jewish people to show that while Jewish people can hide or give up their Jewishness, Black people will always be Black. Fanon looks at how science has been used in the past to justify racism and says, science should be ashamed of itself. He then criticizes the artistic movement called Negritude, saying that trying to reimagine a magical, pre-colonial Black culture won't help Black people in the present, and that some parts of Negritude also confirm racist ideas about Black people. Fanon looks at whether psychoanalytic ideas can be usefully applied to the Black experience in Chapter 6. He says that racism and colonialism make the family lives and early childhoods of white people different from those of Black people. Because of this, he says, many of the main psychoanalytic theories made by white Europeans don't work for many people of color. Fanon says that Black people have a collective unconscious and that collective catharsis is the only way for Black people to heal from the psychological damage caused by colonialism. Fanon criticizes the psychoanalytic idea that all phobias are caused by bad things that happened to a person as a child. Fear or hatred of Black people is called negrophobia, and it has its roots in racist colonial culture. Psychoanalytic theory says that phobias are rooted in sexuality, and Fanon thinks this is true of anti-Black racism, pointing out that violence against Black people is often sexual in nature. Fanon hopes that the collective unconscious of Black people will heal over time, and that Black people won't feel so deeply alone. He ends the chapter with a case study of a white woman who had tics. After getting psychiatric help, it was found that her tics were caused by her fear of Black people. In Chapter 7, the work of psychoanalyst Alfred Adler is looked at. Fanon likes some of what Adler writes, but he says that Adler thinks about psychology too much in terms of the individual, without thinking about things like racism. Fanon says that colonialism has made the whole area of the Antilles a neurotic society. He thinks about how the psychological relationship between master and slave still affects people today, even though slavery has been outlawed. Fanon admits in the last chapter that different colonized groups around the world will need their own unique solutions to the problems he has pointed out. He says that dignity and reason won't change the world on their own, and that sometimes conflict will be necessary. He decides not to dwell on the past but to live in the present, and he commits himself to making sure that no one will ever again be a slave. He ends by asking people to be truly open-minded and praying that he himself will always be a man who questions.
About the author. Frantz Fanon was born in 1925 in Fort-de-France, Martinique, to a family from the middle class. He went to the best high school in Martinique, where he was taught by M. Césaire, a Martinican scholar, poet, and politician who was against imperialism. Fanon went to Dominica during the Second World War to join the Free French forces and fight against the fascist Vichy regime. He was given a French military honor called the Croix de Guerre. Fanon went back to Martinique and helped Césaire run for office as a communist. Then he went to Lyon to finish his education. In 1951, he became a psychiatrist. His first book, Black Skin, White Masks, came out in 1952 while he was doing his residency in psychiatry in Saint-Alban-sur-Limagnol. Fanon then moved to Algeria and worked in a psychiatric hospital, where he helped both Algerian torture victims and French soldiers who had been traumatized by torturing Algerians. Fanon was deeply affected by this event, and he gradually started to focus more on helping Algerians get their freedom. He quit his job at the French hospital, and the French government kicked him out of Algeria soon after. Fanon married a white French woman named Josie. They had 2 children together, one of whom was from a previous relationship. The Wretched of the Earth, his most famous book, came out just before he died of leukemia at age 36 in 1961.
Hope we summarized it fully and you liked it. Please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel so that we are motivated to create more videos.